Alesta was making it quite difficult for me to season the ground beef as she kept winding around my legs, drooling. After tripping on her twice, I told her to stay out of the way if she wanted any of this chili. Her response was to stretch out and wrap herself around my body like a furry boa, her head leaning over my shoulder as she sniffed at the simmering pot. I couldn't help but chuckle as I braced myself under her weight. I held up a morsel of meat in front of her snout and she gobbled it up with a happy chirp. She stuck out one of her pointy legs, poking blindly in search for more, and I tapped it with my spoon as I told her to be patient. She sighed and rested her large head on top of mine, the drool trickling down my face. I should invest in some goggles. I should invest in a lot of things, and I will once I get a job. I glanced at my phone and dozens of applications a day, not a single phone call or email for an interview. This economy was miserable. I was lucky I ended up in this apartment where at least I didn't have to worry about food as free meal prep boxes were delivered daily. I also didn't have to worry about security. Thanks to Alesta, the basics were covered, including much needed companionship, but I wanted more for us, and I hoped the future would bring it. A knock at the door made us jump. I wasn't expecting anyone. I had no one to expect. While I stood there frozen, Alesta slithered off me. I expected her to make a beeline to the cupboard to hide, but to my horror, she made her way to the door instead, chirping. I turned the stove off and ran after her, shushing her under my breath as another knock thudded against my door. Alesta didn't listen as she chirped again, and I cringed, hoping whoever was outside couldn't hear her. "Yori? I know you're in there." My panic decreased slightly. That was Lita, the previous tenant of this apartment. That explained Alesta's familiarity. She probably thought that if she didn't need to hide from me anymore, then she didn't need to hide from the others who'd fed her, and that wasn't safe. All the tenants who'd lived there for the past 10 years had fed Alesta. Unbeknownst to them, she knew them, but they didn't know her. I was the only one who had the pleasure of meeting her after she saved my life. "Yori, open up! I can see your shadow under the door." "Yeah, I'll be right there. I misplaced the keys." I didn't know Lita that well. We'd spoken face to face once and on the phone once. It wasn't that I found her shady. She was actually quite nice, but I didn't want to put Alesta in danger. Huffing and puffing, I dragged a wriggling Alesta to the bathroom and told her to remain quiet until I came back. She tilted her head in confusion, and I whispered sorry before I closed the bathroom and ran towards the main one. Hey, hi, Lita, what's up?" I said, leaning against the frame. My tense nonchalance didn't fool her, as she squeezed past me and stood in the living room, her arms crossed. With a tight smile, I closed the door and joined her, my arms mirroring hers as I met her suspicious curiosity with concern. "Is something wrong? It's true, isn't it? The story you wrote." My heart dropped. She read it? I winced in regret. I shouldn't have posted on such a popular site. I also shouldn't have left in so many identifiable details. I omitted the address and altered names, but anyone who had lived here could easily recognize the rule. "Isn't it?" She stepped closer. "Have we really been feeding a cryptid through the sink?" I sputtered out an exaggerated laugh. No, of course not. I made it all up." Her eyes widened as her gaze fell behind me. "Then what is that?" I whipped around and my heart dropped to my feet as I saw Alesta making her way to her former roommate. When did she learn how to open doors? I turned back to Lita in a panic, my arms spread, not sure who I should be shielding from the other as my thoughts whirred. It turned out I didn't have to shield anyone. "Wow," Lita breathed and all. "She is real." I wasn't expecting her reaction, and I had no idea how to reply as I remained standing there like a discombobulated scarecrow. Lita didn't back away when Alesta slithered closer, but she did fall over when Alesta lurched her excited weight on her. I gasped and ran over, afraid Lita would start screaming, but instead, she began laughing as Alesta nuzzled her face. "I can't believe she's real." She sat up and hugged Alesta, whispering, "You were the one who stopped Donovan, weren't you? When he was drunk and banging on the bathroom door." Alesta gurgled, snuggling. Lita blinked back tears. Thank you. He was so drunk he didn't remember what happened. He thought he fell down the stairs, but I knew. I knew it was my protector. My body twitched with adrenaline as my mind tried to keep up with this sudden turn of events. Lita knew about Alesta? That wasn't good, but Lita was grateful to her. That was good. Now what? You won't tell anyone about her, will you? Lita glanced up at me with a frown. You already did that. You got any idea how stupid it was to post that story? Every person who's lived here now knows where to find her. There's a chance they didn't read it. I fumbled for my phone and poked at its black screen before I ran to plug it in. It hasn't been up that long. I'll delete it in the moment this piece of junk starts up. That won't change anything. Once something's online, it's there forever. News will spread, and if someone comes for Alesta, their intentions might not be as good as ours. They could have weapons, tranks, and backup. My panic restarted. What should we do? Lita stood up, thinking as she ran her hand over Alesta's head. She can stay with me. I blinked, dumbfounded. What? I owe her my life too. I want her to be safe. But I take good care of her. How will you protect her if a bunch of guys barge in to trank her and take her away? She hides when there are strangers around, and I'll say that I made up the story. What if they start torturing you, and she comes out to protect you? Despair wrung my heart. And what if a previous tenant drops by like I did, and she comes out to say hello? I looked at Alesta, scouring my mind to find a way to steer the argument back in my favor. I didn't want to lose her, but I did want her safe. And time was of the essence. I wiped my nose on my sleeve, sniffling, and Alesta slid closer, stretching up and nuzzling my cheek in concern. Clinging onto my last thread of hope, I hugged her and turned to Lita. Can you give me a loan? I'll move to a new place and take Alesta with me, and when I get a job, I'll pay you back with interest. Yori, I live paycheck to paycheck. I'm lucky I got out of the slums, but I'm not rolling in it. My shoulders slumped as reality siphoned all hope. I wasn't ready to tell Alesta goodbye, but didn't want my selfishness to put her at risk. I made that stupid mistake of posting the story, and now I must pay for it. Before I could admit defeat and give in, Lita spoke up. You can come too. I frowned, not sure I heard right. What? Just now, when I mentioned them torturing you, I realized they could still torture you for info if they find you here. This is your fault, but I don't want you to get hurt. You can both live with me until you find a job. I didn't know how many times I said thank you, but I couldn't stop until Lita told me to shut up. I promised to do all the chores and cook and clean, and she told me we'd figure out the details later. Right now, we had to figure out how to transport Alesta. She could stretch herself thin, but her mass remained the same. We debated whether or not it would look strange if we wrapped her around ourselves, but we nixed the idea when we feared she'd be recognized by anyone who'd read the story and was monitoring the building. Lita tossed her backpack on the floor and unzipped it, sighing as she wished Alesta could fit. Alesta sniffed around until she found the bag, and she curled up over it, crushing it beneath her. She then let out a strange howl that sounded like a foghorn with laryngitis, and Lita and I both gasped as Alesta began puking. Not just food. Everything. I put my hands over my mouth in horrified shock as vaguely familiar organs spewed from her mouth. Intestines, a liver, was that a lung? Pieces of her centipede legs soon followed. I knew she retracted them when she wasn't using them, and I figured they were collapsible since she remained quite flexible. But I never imagined they were disposable, as they now lay atop a glistening pile of entrails. The more Alesta vomited, the more she appeared to shrink in size, and my jaw hung open in realization. Did she understand what we were trying to do? Was she trying so hard to please us that she was killing herself in order to fit inside the backpack? I turned to Lita, my fretful worry a stark contrast to her smile. She's like a sea cucumber, she said, talking over Alesta's retching and hurling. I stared at her, baffled. What? They throw up their insides to distract the enemy, and then grow them back. Except she's throwing them up to get smaller. She'll grow all that back? I asked, hopeful as I pointed to the pile of innards. I think so. As the grand finale, Alesta's teeth rained out of her mouth like ivory icicles, clinking against the cracked floor. She was now the size of a porcupine. She looked like one too, with her abundant fur sticking up from all angles. Her skin must be insanely stretchy for it to not sag after a transformation like that. After licking her lips, Alesta nestled inside the backpack and chirped, pleased with herself. She was adorable, and Lita and I showered her with praise and pets before we looked up at the glistening pile of refuse. We had to get rid of it. Help me throw all of this into the garbage disposal, I said, pulling my sleeves up. The longer we stay here, the less safe it is for Alesta, Lita said, zipping up her backpack, especially with her small now. We can't leave this here. She pulled out her phone, and a few seconds later, mine chimed. I walked over to where it was charging, and she'd sent me a message. An address. That's where I live. I'll go and take Alesta with me. You can clean up, grab all the stuff you need, and follow me. I nodded. Alright, I won't take long. Lita left, and I got to work dumping the slimy collection of guts, legs, and teeth into the garbage disposal. After I finished, I slung my backpack on my back, dashed out of my apartment, and raced down the stairs, only to crash into a large man on the sidewalk. The collision left us both reeling, and as I stumbled back before I held up my hands in apology, the man glared at me as he picked up his fallen duffel bag, spewing curses in his guttural baritone. Not having time to waste, I apologized yet again before I ran off, his insults following me. After running for 6 blocks, I stood at the bus stop and patted myself down. My stomach dropped. My phone wasn't in my pocket. I checked my bag. It wasn't in there either. Did I forget it charging at home? Now I was the one cursing as I sprinted back 6 blocks and ran up the stairs. Wiping my sweat, I made my way to my apartment, and there, on the counter, was my phone, charging, Lita's message still on the lock screen. Relieved and irritated by my forgetfulness, I grabbed it and rushed back to the bus stop. Lita lived all the way across town, and it took me 3 buses to get there. Her building had an elevator, and I was grateful as I made my way to the 10th floor and knocked on her apartment door. When she didn't answer, I knocked again, worry gnawing at the corners of my mind. After a 3rd knock was met with silence, I called her. There was no answer. I texted her. No answer. I called again and again, one hand redialing when the other banged on the door. No answer. This couldn't be happening. I looked around in panic. Did she trick me? Was this not her address? Did she kidnap Alesta right in front of me, playing me for a fool? How did I not question her intentions? Why did I trust her so quickly? Why did I let her manipulate me with fear, blind me with urgency, and prod me with emotions? How could she do this to me? How could she do this to Alesta? How could I do this to Alesta? The hallway spun as I cycled between heading to the elevators and returning to the door, my hands fidgeting to the confused chaos in my mind. Lita has to be in there. Maybe I could ask the neighbors if they knew her. I should have taken a look at her car. The police could track her number. What if her phone was a burner? I could put out a missing persons report. Did I want to call the police when Alesta was involved? Alesta. My heart shriveled as I imagined her scared and trapped inside Lita's bag. What was Lita going to do with her? Sell her? Experiment on her? Open up a supernatural zoo? Charge people to watch her do tricks? Eat her? The worse my thoughts got, the more agitated I became. My fretful eyes roaming the hall as though they expected a solution to materialize from the wallpaper. I needed fresh air. I couldn't think in this suffocating lie, unable to wait for the elevator. I ran down 10 flights of stairs and flung myself out onto the sidewalk, panting, sweat soaking my shirt. I was panting so hard I almost didn't hear my phone ring. The moment I saw Lita's number, I swiped the screen and smashed it against my ear. Where are you? This is the lowest I'd ever seen you, Lita said in disgust, a car engine rumbling in the background. I bristled in offense and hurry. Where the hell are you? I clammed up as a guttural baritone replied from a distance. Once I find what's under that rubble, you'll be sorry you ever doubted me. What was Duffel Bag Guy doing with Lita? Were they in on this together? Why was she calling me? Why are you so obsessed with the Ardell mansion? Lita asked, enunciating more than usual. It's been picked clean. There's nothing there. There is. And that thing is gonna find it for me. Thing? Did he mean Alesta? There's nothing there, Donovan. Donovan? As in drunk Donovan who Alesta attacked to save Lita? There is, he said. And we're not leaving until it finds it. And if we find something, then what? The engine rumbled in the uncomfortable silence. Donovan? And then what? You'll find out. You know, all I've got to do is scream right now and Alesta will attack you. You do that, and your photos go straight to your boss, Donovan growled. Okay, look, how about this? You let us both go once you find whatever you find, and I won't turn you in for violating your restraining order and blackmailing me to force me to keep Alesta from tearing you to pieces. You'll never turn me in, because you know that if you do, I won't cancel that scheduled email for those pics. You sick bastard. You know Alesta spared your drunk ass that day because you used to feed her. She could have easily killed you and ate you all up, but she didn't. She had mercy. Where's yours? Mercy is a weakness. I can't believe I used to date you, Lita grumbled. How did you even find out where I lived? I still had the key for our old place. The idiot that moved in after you didn't bother to change the locks. I didn't find the monster or the idiot, but I found your address on their phone. Damn it, Yori, Lita whispered before the line went dead. The silent phone stayed pressed to my ear as I stared at the sidewalk, trying to put together the pieces of Lita's calculated dialogue. Donovan, Lita's abusive ex, had kidnapped Lita and Alesta and was driving them to the Ardell mansion? And he was blackmailing Lita to ensure she wouldn't sick Alesta on him? And it was my fault he found them. It was my fault that all of this was happening in the first place. Everyone's fate after Donovan finds what he wants was still a mystery. A mystery I wasn't interested in finding out. I had to help right now. We couldn't call the police without Donovan running his mouth about Alesta and exposing something Lita wanted hidden. I didn't know anyone I trusted enough to ask for advice or help. I had to go to the Ardell mansion alone. I just had to find it. A quick search on my phone told me it used to be popular with explorers and looters before the police sealed it off. It was an hour away, and the rattling change in my wallet wasn't going to be enough. I was going to have to hitchhike. Hopefully that goes off without a hitch. Hopefully, if Lita was right and the mansion was picked clean, they might still be there empty-handed by the time I arrive. Hopefully I would have come up with a plan by then. I hadn't. An hour later, I was waving goodbye to a friendly farmer as I jogged from his truck to the crumbling mansion looming ahead. What was I gonna do? I had no weapon. I had no backup. I had no idea what Donovan was capable of. Would he kill them? Keep them prisoners to do his bidding? Ducking beneath police tape and squeezing through a hole in the chain link fence, I inched my way to the nearest entrance, my heart drumming against my ribs. Sneaking through a broken door, I held my breath as the musty humidity coated my skin, my eyes and my ears on high alert. Echoes. I heard echoes of an argument between Lita and Donovan. Fearing I'd get noticed if I turned on my phone's flashlight, I stumbled through the dark instead as I made my way towards them. The closer I got, the more heated their argument became, spurring my pulse as I hoped things wouldn't get out of hand. She already found you a fortune. What more do you want? Lita yelled. Send it back or I'm not canceling the email. She went back 5 times already. There's nothing else. There's more in there. I know it, Donovan said. Send it back. You heartless pig. She's blind. She did the best she could. She's exhausted. Look at her. It can rest once it's found more. Tell it to go back and to squeeze further down. Now. My eyes picked up a faint light from a room up ahead, and I tiptoed towards it, the argument getting louder and clearer. With a tense breath, I peeked in, my throat dry with nerves and dust. Donovan and Lita were standing inside an enormous library under a halo of floating dust illuminated by his flashlight. Bare, broken shelves lined the walls top to bottom, except for the wall at the far end. That one had been reduced to rubble, and that was the one Donovan seemed interested in finding what was beneath it. His back was to me, his light focused on Lita's face, neither of them aware of my presence as they yelled at each other. I craned my neck as I squinted in the shadows, and I couldn't make out Alesta. Where was she? My worry overriding my fear, I tiptoed closer, hoping the bickering two couldn't hear the debris grinding under my shoes or the frantic heart rattling in my chest. Donovan's light shifted, and I gasped as I ducked behind a toppled armchair, clamping my hand over my mouth as a rat scuttled out of its tattered fabric. He cursed at the road and went back to arguing with Lita, and I let out a quivering sigh of relief. Testing my luck, I peeked around the armchair, and joy soothed my frazzled mind. Alesta was sniffing the air as she slithered towards me. She knew I was here. It was so strange seeing her that size, and I clenched my jaw when I saw the thick layer of dust and filth coating her onyx fur. Donovan really was a heartless pig. Now you know what? How about this? Lita snapped. You cancel the email and delete the pics, or I'll scream. You do that, and your boss will get your photos, and you'll be dead. I'm counting to 3. 1, you're bluffing. 2, Lita. I held my breath. Was she actually gonna do it? 3. I jumped as Lita's scream filled the room, and Alesta turned her head towards the noise, her ears perked up in concern. Donovan turned around too, and I gasped as he whipped out a gun. There was no hesitation as he aimed it at Alesta, and there was no hesitation as I dashed out from behind the armchair. A gunshot rang, and Lita's scream filled the room again as I crashed to the floor, the hot sting in my arm mutating to searing pain. After a second of mind-numbing shock, I scrambled to my knees, clutching my injured limb as I tried to shield Alesta again, but she wasn't waiting for me, and my heart dropped as she slithered past me and charged at Donovan. He aimed his gun again, and I cried out for him to stop, but he couldn't hear me above Alesta's ear-splitting screeches. Lita kicked the back of his leg, and his bullet missed its mark, and he fell to his knees. I tensed up as they began wrestling for the gun, but the three of us soon forgot all about it when Alesta spat out a jet of red fluid. Donovan got the brunt of it, and he wailed as he held his hands to his sizzling face, steam curling around his head. Lita stumbled away, shaking the liquid off of her blistered hand as we both stared in terrified shock at Alesta. With her fur puffed and toothless gums bared, she was an unrestrained force weaving around Donovan as she continued to spit acid at him, drops flying around the room. As Donovan shrieked and writhed, his skin melting off of his liquefying bones, Lita ran over to me, both of us wincing as wayward droplets burned through our clothes. Ducking behind the armchair, we hugged each other as we listened to Donovan's tortured caterwauling, our rapid pulses in sync. I thought Alesta's centipede form was terrifying, but this type of unbridled fury was something else. This wasn't only protection, this was hate. Was it because he shot at her? Was it because he shot me? Was it because she felt betrayed by the man who used to feed her? Was it because both Lita and I were in distress because of him? Was it all of the above? After a few agonizing minutes, Alesta stopped screeching, and the silence hung heavy in the metallic air. Trembling, Lita and I peeked above the armchair, and my stomach lurched at the sight of Donovan, or what was left of him. A bloody puddle of dissolved guts and bone, scraps of fabric, half a shoe, an ear, and a couple of fingers. After prying my disturbed gaze away from the mess, I saw Alesta sniffing the air, trying to locate us. She seemed weary, swaying as she cocked her ears and tilted her head in concentration. I met Lita's eyes and nodded. Alesta seemed to have calmed down. It was safe to approach her. "Alesta? We're here," I said, crawling out from behind the armchair. She gurgled and slithered over, her tired breaths wheezing. We held our arms out for a hug, only to find ourselves waiting as she stopped and began licking her fur. Lita said she was probably cleaning off any acid residue, and I found that touchingly considerate. After making sure she couldn't accidentally hurt us, she slid right into our hugs. We held her tight as she nuzzled us in concern. We thanked her and assured her we were all right, drowning her in love and praise as she chirped in our arms and licked our faces. While Alesta snuggled, I looked at Lita with a regretful frown, and she shook her head in mild irritation. "What kind of moron forgets their phone at home?" she whispered. "I'm sorry, I know all of this is my fault." I looked at her hand. "How badly are you hurt?" She inspected the smattering of blisters. "I've had worse." She turned to my arm. "We've got to stop the bleeding." I took off my canvas belt, and she got to work wrapping my wound as Alesta poked her nose at it in curiosity. After cinching the belt and making me wince, Lita sat back with a sigh, eyeing the Donovan puddle. "I'm sorry about the photos, whatever that's about," I said. Lita studied the puddle in silence for a few more seconds before she stood up and crossed the room. After grabbing the gun and the familiar duffel bag, she began inspecting Donovan's remains, and I puked in my mouth as she used the weapon to fish out 2 fingers. I watched in horrifying disgust as she rinsed them with water from the bag and dried them on her shirt, her determined expression stony. Alesta squirmed in my arms, drooling as she sniffed towards the puddle, and I held her tighter. "Let her eat. She's starving," Lita said, walking over to sit beside me again. "No, I don't want her to get used to eating human flesh." "Why?" "She's helping clean up, and she's getting nutrition. And Donovan's a lot of nutrition." "Because she lives with humans. It's like me being a French fry. There will eventually be a point where the temptation to eat me becomes too much." A chuckle cracked her hard expression. "Didn't know you had a sense of humor." "I don't! I mean, I do, but I was being serious. Just let her eat for now." She pulled a phone out of her duffel bag and let me focus. I stared in disbelief as she began testing Donovan's severed digits on the fingerprint sensor. To my baffled surprise, one of them actually worked, and Lita smiled as she began scrolling. Realizing the futility of her squirming, Alesta leaned her head against my chest and whined like a sad puppy. And I broke. "We could work out the rules later," she chirped as I let her go, and I watched with a resigned sigh as she slurped up Donovan, her body rippling with each gulp. A few minutes later, Lita tossed the phone back in the duffel bag with a triumphant smile. "And that's that." "You deleted the photos?" "Yes. And canceled the scheduled email." "That's awesome. That was clever using his fingers." "And gross." "I did what I had to. It took me forever to secure that job." With my adrenaline dwindling, the pain was becoming aggressive, and I winced as I held my arm. Lita shifted closer and checked the belt, a gentleness softening her face. "That was pretty cool what you did, protecting Alesta like that," she said. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." "I'm sorry. I didn't know we had a gun." "I wouldn't have screamed. I'm really glad you were there. I'm not glad you were shot, of course, just that, you know." "I know. We should get you to a hospital." I sighed. "Great. More debt. Maybe these'll help." She reached into the bag and tossed a tiny leather pouch at me. I opened it. "What are these, pennies?" I asked, pouring a dozen coins in my palm. "They look like pennies, but not like any I've seen before. Donovan said they could be worth a fortune." "Is he an expert?" I gasped, chuckling. "Whoa. Hey, Alesta." Alesta had slithered over, now 7 times larger, and dumped her weight on me, nearly making me drop the coins. She sniffed at them and grunted, and Lita laughed as she collected them back in her pouch. "Don't worry, Alesta. You'll never have to search for stuff like this ever again." Lita stood up and slung the duffel bag on her shoulder before reaching down. "Need a hand there, French fry?" "Very funny," I said, accepting her help as I got to my feet. Alesta wrapped herself around my body and I staggered, my injury not helping with her weight. Nonetheless, I was able to carry her. But Lita reached out, calling her over. Alesta chirped and stretched out, curling around Lita and binding us together for a few seconds before she released me. Adjusting my shirt, I nodded, and the 3 of us made our way to Donovan's car.